blood on the sheets, the blood on his hands. His stomach churned, and a wave of nausea washed over him. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What have I done?" The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "Get out!" she said, her voice shaking. "Get out!" James didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He grabbed his clothes and fled the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he was back in his own room, the door locked behind him. He stripped off his blood-stained shorts and shoved them into the bottom of his bag, his hands trembling. By the time he made it back home, it was just past 10 p.m. Clara was in the living room, watching TV with the baby asleep in her arms. She looked up as he walked in, her expression unreadable. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with something he couldn't quite place. James opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. How could he tell her the truth? How could he explain what he had done? The rain tapped softly against the window pane, a rhythmic patter that did little to soothe the tension in the room. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her back turned to James, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her oversized sweatshirt. It was the same one she'd been wearing for 3 days now, stained with coffee and baby formula. Her hair, once shiny and meticulously styled, was pulled into a messy bun, strands escaping in every direction. She didn't look like the woman James had married 5 years ago, the woman who used to light up a room with her laughter and her confidence. James stood by the dresser, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had tried to start this conversation a dozen times, but the words always seemed to catch in his throat. Tonight, though, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but strained. "We need to talk." She didn't turn around. "About what?" Her tone was flat, dismissive, as if she already knew what he was going to say and had no interest in hearing it. "About us," he said, taking a step closer. "About how things have been, or haven't been. I feel like we're strangers living in the same house." Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "What do you expect, James? I'm exhausted. The baby barely sleeps, and when she does, I have a million other things to do. I don't have time to be the perfect wife you want me to be." James ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. "It's not about being perfect, Clara. It's about us. About connecting. I miss you. I miss us." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes tired and hollow. "You miss us? Or do you just miss the way I used to look? The way I used to dress up for you like some kind of trophy?" James flinched, her words hitting him like a slap. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "I love you, Clara. All of you. But you've shut me out. You don't talk to me anymore. You don't even look at me." Clara stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "Maybe I wouldn't have to shut you out if you actually helped around here instead of expecting me to do everything. You come home from work, sit on the couch, and zone out. Do you even notice how hard I'm trying?" James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he did notice, that he was trying too. But the truth was, he didn't know how to fix this. The distance between them felt like a chasm, growing wider with every passing day. The baby's cry pierced the silence, sharp and urgent. Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping as she turned toward the nursery. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll talk later." But they both knew they wouldn't. The conversation, like so many others, would be left unfinished, buried under the weight of exhaustion and resentment. James watched her walk away, a sinking feeling in his chest. He wanted to follow her, to wrap his arms around her and tell her that they could figure this out together. But something stopped him, a fear that she would push him away, that she didn't want him anymore. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and slipped out the front door, slammed the front door behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house. He didn't bother to check if Clara heard him. He didn't care. The tension between them had become unbearable, and he needed to get out, to breathe, to think, to escape the suffocating silence that had taken over their home. He grabbed his car keys and headed to the one place he knew he could find solace, the bar where his friends often gathered. It was a dimly lit, unassuming spot, the kind of place where the drinks were strong and the conversations were louder than the music. When he walked in, his friends were already there, seated at their usual corner table. They greeted him with claps on the back and raised glasses, but their smiles faded when they saw the look on his face. "Rough day, huh?" Mark, his closest friend, asked as James slumped into a chair. "You could say that," James muttered, signaling the bartender for a whiskey. He didn't elaborate, but his friends didn't need him to. They had heard enough about the struggles between him and Clara to know what was eating at him. As the night wore on, James drank more than he should have. His friends tried to lighten the mood with jokes and stories, but James's mind kept drifting back to Clara, to the way she used to laugh, to the way she used to look at him. Now, all he saw when he looked at her was exhaustion and indifference. She had changed, and so had he. By the time the bar began to empty out, James was slurring his words and swaying in his seat. His friends exchanged worried glances. "You're in no state to drive, man," Mark said. "Let's get you a room upstairs." The bar was connected to a small hotel, a convenient arrangement for nights like this. Mark helped James to his feet and guided him to the front desk, where they booked a room for the night. James barely registered what was happening as they led him to the elevator and down the hallway to his room. "Get some sleep, okay?" Mark said, patting him on the shoulder before leaving him alone. James stumbled into the room, the world spinning around him. He collapsed onto the bed, his head pounding, but the alcohol hadn't dulled the ache in his chest. He lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, until the pressure in his bladder forced him to get up. He staggered to the bathroom, his steps unsteady. On his way back, he noticed the door to the room across the hall was slightly ajar. Through the crack, he caught a glimpse of a woman, a beautiful young waitress, no older than 25, with long, dark hair and delicate features. She was dressed in a simple, faded dress that clung to her slender frame, and in his drunken state, she reminded him of Clara during their early days together. Her beauty was striking, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made her seem vulnerable. "Clara?" he mumbled, his voice thick with alcohol. He pushed the door open, his vision blurry. The woman turned to face him, her eyes wide with surprise. She wasn't Clara, but in his drunken state, James didn't care. All he saw was the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he missed so desperately. "Sir, please," the woman started, her voice trembling, but James didn't let her finish. He crossed the room in a few unsteady steps, his hands reaching for her. She tried to push him away, but he was too strong, too determined. In his mind, this was his chance to reclaim what he had lost, to feel close to Clara again, even if it was just an illusion. What happened next was a blur. The woman's protests, her struggles, the sound of fabric tearing, it all faded into the background as James gave in to his impulses. When it was over, he collapsed onto the bed, his mind foggy and his body heavy. It wasn't until he heard the woman sobbing that reality began to sink in. He turned to look at her, his heart pounding. She was curled up on the bed, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears. And then he saw it, the blood on the sheets, the blood on his hands. His stomach churned, and a wave of nausea washed over him. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What have I done?" The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "Get out!" she said, her voice shaking. "Get out!" James didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He grabbed his clothes and fled the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he was back in his own room, the door locked behind him. He stripped off his blood-stained shorts and shoved them into the bottom of his bag, his hands trembling. By the time he made it back home, it was just past 10 p.m. Clara was in the living room, watching TV with the baby asleep in her arms. She looked up as he walked in, her expression unreadable. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with something he couldn't quite place. James opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. How could he tell her the truth? How could he explain what he had done? Instead, he muttered something about needing some air and headed straight for the shower. As the water washed over him, he tried to scrub away the guilt, the shame, the memory of what had happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the truth. His life, his marriage, everything he had built, it was all crumbling around him. James stood in the kitchen, staring at the mess in front of him. Dirty dishes were piled high in the sink, crumbs littered the countertops, and the trash can overflowed with empty baby formula cans and food wrappers. The smell of spoiled milk hung in the air, mixing with the faint odor of sweat and neglect. He clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. This wasn't the life he had signed up for. It had been years since he and Clara had shared a moment of genuine intimacy. At first, he had tried to be understanding. She was exhausted from taking care of the kids, and he knew that being a mother was no easy task. But over time, her lack of effort had worn him down. She often went days without bathing, and when she did, it was a rushed, half-hearted attempt. The few times they had tried to be intimate, the smell of her unwashed body had made it unbearable. He had tried to talk to her about it, but she always brushed him off, accusing him of being selfish and unsupportive. Now James had stopped trying altogether. He had found other ways to cope, ways that didn't involve coming home to a messy house and a wife who seemed to have given up on herself. He had started spending more time at work, going out with friends, and occasionally seeking comfort in the arms of other women. At first, it had been just a way to escape, but now it had become a habit. He didn't care anymore. He felt disconnected from Clara, from his family, from the life he had once dreamed of. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Clara standing in the doorway, her hair unkempt and her clothes stained. She looked at him with tired eyes, but there was a flicker of something else. Desperation, maybe. "James," she said softly, "we need to talk." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "About what, Clara? The mess? The fact that you haven't showered in days? Or maybe the fact that I can't even remember the last time we had a real conversation?" Clara flinched, her face flushing with anger and shame. "You think I don't know how hard this is for you? You think I don't see the way you look at me, like I'm some kind of burden? I'm trying, James. I'm trying to take care of 3 kids, keep this house running, and somehow still be the wife you want me to be. But it's not easy." James shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You're not trying, Clara. You've given up. You've let yourself go, and you've let this house go. I come home every day to chaos, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only one who cares." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "And what about you, James? You think I don't notice how much time you spend away from home? How you come back late at night, smelling like alcohol and perfume? Do you think I'm stupid?" James froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't realized she knew, or at least suspected, but instead of feeling guilty, he felt a surge of anger. "What do you expect, Clara? You've pushed me away for years. You've made it clear that you don't care about me or this marriage. So yeah, I found someone who does." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Clara stared at him, her face pale, before turning and walking away without another word. James watched her go, a part of him wanting to call her back, to apologize, to fix this. But another part of him, the part that had grown cold and indifferent, didn't care. Over the next few weeks, Clara tried to reach out to him in small ways. She cleaned the house, cooked his favorite meals, and even made an effort to dress up. But it was too little, too late. James had already checked out. He continued to spend his nights away from home, seeking solace in the company of other women. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He didn't care about the hurt he was causing. Clara, desperate and heartbroken, began calling his family, pleading with them to talk some sense into him. "He doesn't care about us anymore," she told his mother, her voice breaking. "He's never home, and when he is, he's distant and cold. I don't know what to do." But even their intervention didn't change anything. James had built a wall around himself, and no one could break through it. He had convinced himself that this was just the way things were now, that he was trapped in a marriage that had lost its spark, and there was no going back. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Clara's hope began to fade. She had tried everything she could think of to save their marriage, but James was no longer the man she had married. He was a stranger, and she was left to pick up the pieces of the life they had once shared. But what Clara didn't know was that James's reckless choices were about to catch up with him in ways neither of them could have imagined. When a mysterious woman from his past resurfaces with a shocking revelation, will it finally force James to confront the damage he's caused, or will it destroy everything he has left? Stay tuned for part 2, where secrets unravel, loyalties are tested, and the truth threatens to tear their world apart.